Welcome to the latest Evershed Sutherland Legal Insights podcast.
Hello, I'm Matthew Allen, Global Head of Financial Services at Evershed Sutherland. Welcome to the latest in a series of podcasts which will explore the current and likely future direction of private equity and venture capital markets across Europe. We're thrilled to have been named Pan-European Legal Advisor of the Year at the 23rd Annual Real Deals Private Equity Awards. And against that backdrop, and over the next few weeks, I'll be speaking to our private equity and venture partners in a number of jurisdictions across Europe to get a temperature check on current deal activity, industry trends, and market outlook. Today, we'll be looking at the VC market in France, and to help us do this, I'm delighted to be joined by my Paris-based colleague, Cristina. Cristina, hi. Thank you for joining us today. Maybe you could just kick off, tell us a little bit about the current state of the venture market in France as it stands.
Sure, Matthew. So I'd start by saying that last year was a true year of disruption for the French venture ecosystem because we've experienced 10 years of continued growth in terms of the amounts raised. And then last year saw a steep decline to the lowest level since 2020. So the amounts raised went down by almost 40% since 2022. And it wasn't as much a decline in the number of deals, which was actually quite flat, but the average ticket dropped by over a third. So as in other jurisdictions, I'd say that last year marked the end of what was easy money for the French tech and the beginning of a much tougher fundraising environment. It's more challenging for funders to raise capital and to close rounds. And as in other M&A deals, processes are slower and lengthier. The DDs are more thorough, and there's an overall higher risk of the deals not closing. Investors obviously have more opportunities to pick from, and there's less competition on deals on average. So on the heels of that, 2024 started quite slow. The numbers for H1 show that there were about 413 closed rounds with a total amount raised of about 4.3 billion euros. So the aggregate deal value was quite stable, and the deal volume saw a slight uptick of about, I think it was around 5% compared to H1 2023. So I think the sluggish period that began last year is still continuing. And we're still seeing, as in other jurisdictions, that many of the VCs continue to focus on providing support to their existing portfolio companies and doubling down on their winners versus investing new tickets in new companies. So there is some cautious optimism because of H1 numbers this year were higher than H2 of 2023. And also we've seen an increased level of activity at the earlier stages of the deals in early stage fundraisers. It does seem because of that the market has bottomed out and is beginning to rebound. And just a last remark on that, I'd say that overall we've seen fewer deals at higher valuations. The number of deals over 25 million euros in value has more than doubled compared to last year, which means that the best targets out there are still attracting a lot of the attention and competition between the investors, and they get good valuations, while the tail struggles to raise funds.
And just picking up on some of the themes that you've just mentioned, where are the bright spots that you see in the period ahead in terms of particular sectors or particular areas of investment that you think will be a hot topic or an area of focus in France in the coming period?
Yeah, so there are a few trends, I would say, sectors that align, I would say, with the trends internationally. Firstly, there's an increased focus on deep tech and deep tech startups, which involve advanced technologies in areas such as AI, quantum computing, robotics, are receiving significant attention from VCs in this market. And these startups often in France emerge from research and academic institutions and are attracting substantial funding due to their disruptive potential. And obviously, the Gen AI and ML sector is definitely on the rise in France as it is internationally. This year, we've seen Mistral AI, which is the French and European AI alternative, complete two fundraisers. The first one was at about 400 million euros at a 1.8 billion post-money valuation. And the second one, which closed in June, was a series of 600 million for almost 6 billion in valuation for a company that's a bit over a year old. And there's another example in AI of a company that's called H, which just raised in May 220 million for a seed round. So big amounts of money, early stage in AI. And the second trend that I see we are seeing in France sector-wise is a growing emphasis on sustainable and impact investing. So startups focusing on green tech, renewable energy, circular economy, social impact are increasingly favored by investors. And this is in response to both the LP's ESG more and more stringent requirements, but also to just generally to consumer demands for sustainable solutions. So last year, green tech was by and large the biggest sector in French venture. I think about a third of the funds raised in France were in green tech and clean tech. So very resilient sector that saw a rise both in number of deals and in volume of funds raised.
And just to sort of bring all that to life, can you tell us about any recent deals that you've closed in Paris in this arena?
In clean tech, not really. In clean tech, not really, but we do work a lot in the venture space. And I'd say one of the themes that we are seeing in this sort of downturn environment is there are a lot of sovereign investors, public institutions that get involved in the ecosystem in order to catalyze the private investment. So in France, BPI France is very active. They've participated in like 17% of the fundraisers in Q1 this year, but also the European Innovation Council, for which we work in France for several of their investments, and also in other European jurisdictions. They are very active in the market as well, and they are bringing or helping bring to the table private players as well in these more distressed times.
And looking ahead, Cristina, you talked about cautious optimism earlier. How do you see the next 12 months panning out in terms of the venture space in France? And have you got any top tips for investors, sponsors, and other listeners to this podcast?
Okay, so in terms of how I see the outlook for the following month, 2024 has been and should be going forward an interesting year, giving the very good positive dynamic in certain sectors, as I was mentioning, Gen AI and then green tech, as well as certain favorable macroeconomic trends, like ECB that lowered the interest rate in June and gave some signals that it might do so again in the fall. These factors combined, I think, should contribute to the acceleration of investments for the French tech. And although the impact of recent political instability and public deficit issues in the country, while their impact remains to be seen, the sentiment in the industry is positive. And optimism is driven by some really nice recent rounds, as I was mentioning, Mistral AI, but also from growing access to sources of funding from outside of France. So one of the positive signs that we've seen during the recent period was more and more investment from foreign investors into French VC. And this is kind of different from what's happening in the PE sector and in other sectors where foreign investors have reduced their interest in the market because of potentially some perceived protectionism. But in venture, the US investors in particular, but just non-EU investors have increased their participations in French venture deals. In the first quarter of this year, they accounted for almost half of the total deal value, and they participated in all of the big fundraising rounds. And not only in AI, I mean, AI was a big driver, but also in other sectors, in crypto, in fintech, advertising technology. So I would say the sectors that are on the rise that I mentioned, this involvement from foreign investors and coupled also with the involvement of sovereigns, for me, give a positive outlook to the industry on the whole for the coming 12 months. And also there are good signs from the US, and we typically in the venture industry follow what's going on in the US really closely. In the US, there was an H1 that was quite positive in terms of the amounts raised, an 8-quarter high. So I think that will slowly but surely translate into more deals and more inflow into the French VC market as well. And then you asked me about top tips for investors in the French market. I'd say, and the first one is probably not very jurisdiction specific or not very legal in nature, but I'd say many locally grown startups seek and need investors that can provide more than money, smart money, so long-term value creation for the startups. And an investor can have a privileged position and deal terms if it shows how we can provide that, how we can provide strategic guidance or relationships or synergies or access to international markets and so on and so forth. And as a more legal comment, I'd say for investors that have not invested in the French market yet, there are no standardized investment documents in France venture, as it's the case for early stage, for example, in the US or the UK. But the standard market terms are pretty well developed and they are sophisticated and generally accepted on VC deals. So it's very important that investors investing in this market, in particular in a cross-border context, are well advised and well versed in terms of these market practices and transactions, because otherwise negotiations can get pretty protracted.
Good. Well, certainly we've got the capacity to give great advice in Paris. That's very clear from everything that you shared with us today, Cristina. Thank you for joining us and for your really helpful insights. And of course, thanks to you, the listeners, for joining us as always. If you'd like to know more about our European private equity and venture team or trends and opportunities in venture markets in France in the coming period, please don't hesitate to contact Cristina or myself or your usual Evershed Sutherland contact. Please look out for the next podcast in this series, which will appear on all our usual social media channels in the very near future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Evershed Sutherland Legal Insights podcast.